Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, what does Russia mean by demanding veto power over future assistance to Ukraine, and how would that impact Ukrainian sovereignty?
So, in a press conference on Wednesday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia would only accept international security guarantees for Ukraine if it resembled the terms that it had proposed back in the 2022 Istanbul peace negotiations. Now, for context, in the very beginning of the war, back in March and April 2022, Ukraine and Russia met in Istanbul for the first round of peace talks. And there, Russia proposed that Ukraine demilitarize itself by reducing its military to a token force, that it break all of its international security agreements or like defensive alliances, and that instead, Ukrainian sovereignty be protected by a consortium of security guarantors, of which Russia would be one. However, the caveat here is that Russia wanted to create a system where every guarantor had the ability to veto the military intervention of every other guarantor, which means that Russia would essentially be able to veto Western states from coming to Ukraine's aid in the case of a future Russian invasion. Now, the Ukrainians quite understandably said no, because this is quite obviously a scam. And ever since then, pro-Russian voices have claimed that Ukraine and Russia came very close to a peace deal in 2022 in Istanbul, but it was sabotaged by Western warmongers, even though that's not true at all. But they misrepresent the technicalities of those negotiations. Now, given this context, one would have imagined that the American negotiating team in the Alaska summit last week, where Trump met with Putin, one would imagine that they would have asked when you whether or not Russia wanted veto power over any guarantees. Because on Sunday, Steve Witkoff, who is the special envoy for this region, said, oh, we got this major concession from Russia. They agreed to NATO-style security guarantees. And everyone said, well, what does that mean? Are we just going to see Istanbul play out again? But they didn't ask. And now it turns out that that's exactly what happened. So once again, Russia scammed the West, and Trump and his team, they were too incompetent to notice right away. And now we're back at square one.
And how do Russia's latest demands affect the legitimacy and potential success of any peace agreement with Ukraine?
I mean, this completely ruins everything again, right? Because Russia is demanding that Ukraine hand over its Donetsk province, which is where the bulk of its defensive fortifications are based, including a belt of fortress cities, including Kramatorsk. And so Russia has been trying to take this land for over a year, or at least this belt of fortress cities, and they've been very slow in doing so. So Ukraine is not going to give up this territory, and if it is, in the worst case scenario, forced to give up this territory, it's only going to do so if it's been compensated adequately with real security guarantees. But if Russia wants to be able to veto any defensive intervention from Western states, then there are no security guarantees at all, which means that Ukraine would be giving away key territory for nothing. And the Ukrainians want peace, but they're not crazy and they're not suicidal, so they're not going to agree to that. So there is no peace deal in the near future based on the current terms.
And has the U.S. responded to Russia's new demands, especially considering that President Donald Trump is so involved in these peace negotiations? Or if they haven't responded yet, how do you think that the U.S. is going to respond to this?
They haven't responded to this specifically, and the messaging coming out of Trump right now has been very, very inconsistent. So, for example, on Truth Social, I think yesterday, he made a post indicating that it is unfair that Ukraine is not allowed to strike back deep into Russia. And that is like playing, I don't know, football and only being able to play defensively and not offensively. And so that message was surprising for many pro-Ukrainian voices, because it seemed as if Trump was conceding, or at least accepting or even encouraging, deep strikes into Russia, which is something that the Biden administration always nixed. And so that's very pro-Ukraine. And then on top of that, on Truth Social, Trump also posted an image, two images, where he compared himself with Putin, with Richard Nixon, who was, I think, like Gorbachev or Brezhnev, I forget, whichever Russian leader was, in power at the time of that photo. But essentially, Trump was comparing himself to Nixon, which is also very telling. So those were two very pro-Ukrainian posts. However, I believe today, Trump made an anti-Ukrainian post, because the Ukrainians launched a deep strike into Russia where they destroyed a key pipeline through which Slovakia and Hungary buy a lot of Russian oil and gas. And so the Ukrainians said, nope, that's not going to happen. You're not going to keep on funding Russia's war machine. And they bombed that. And so now Slovakia and Hungary cannot buy Russian gas, or at least through a pipeline. And Trump condemned that. So everything is so chaotic. Sometimes he's pro-Ukraine, sometimes he's anti-Ukraine, sometimes it feels like you just flip a coin. And so no one knows what's going to happen going forward, given how mercurial this man is.
Well, if Russia is granted some form of veto power, what precedent could that set for future peace deals in other conflicts?
I mean, I think it would discredit the West entirely because it would show that the West is willing to accept security agreements that are obviously meaningless. And I think that if we were to have this kind of end to the war, you would see increased nuclearization in the Pacific. Let's be honest. South Korea and Japan are already talking about how they should reconsider their nuclear doctrines or establish nuclear doctrines, given that the United States is demonstrating itself to be an unreliable ally. So if the United States essentially pressured Ukraine to give away its territory in exchange for no real security guarantees, because with the Russian veto, there are no real security guarantees, then you would see a more unstable world where great powers that have relied, or smaller powers that have relied on American protection, will be very desperate for their own nuclear umbrella.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for the time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.